You don't belong on this beach.
The executive's voice sliced through the wind, sharp enough to turn heads and stop laughter mid-breath. He didn't shout. Didn't need to. The tailored linen shirt, the mirrored sunglasses, the subtle gesture toward the roped boundary said everything. Sand shifted under polished loafers as he made it clear the public stretch ended exactly where he decided it did. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Because this wasn't really about sand or shoreline. It was about power drawing lines where it never earned them. A few executives chuckled nervously. Someone lifted a phone, pretending to check messages while recording. The ocean rolled in steady and indifferent, foam hissing against the invisible border between luxury cabanas and worn public towels. The man being addressed didn't argue. Marcus Hale stood with one hand wrapped around his son's narrow shoulder and the other holding a blue inhaler warmed by the sun. His work boots were dusted with sand. The logo on his faded resort maintenance shirt was half peeled from salt and time. He didn't step back. He didn't step forward either. He just looked at the tide. Evan leaned against him, breathing lightly, the faint whistle in his chest almost lost beneath the crash of distant waves. The boy's fingers curled into his father's shirt, as if the fabric itself anchored him. Marcus's eyes tracked the water instead of the executive. 30 yards out, a darker seam cut through the glittering surface, subtle, almost elegant. Most people would miss it. He didn't. "I'm not interfering with your event," he said evenly. "We're on public sand." The executive's smile didn't reach his eyes. Move further down. A camera flash popped behind them. Laughter resumed. Thinner this time. Marcus exhaled slowly, steady as a metronome. He felt his son's ribs rise and fall. That rhythm mattered more than pride. Losing this job wasn't an option. Not with hospital bills folded into the kitchen drawer at home. Not with an 8-year-old who needed air measured in doses. "All right," he answered. He guided Evan a few steps toward the rougher stretch of shoreline where the manicured umbrellas gave way to driftwood and uneven dunes. The sand felt coarser here. The water sounded different too. Less playful, more purposeful. Behind them, music swelled from hidden speakers. Glass clinked. The executive resumed greeting investors as if nothing had happened. Marcus knelt beside his son and adjusted the brim of the boy's cap. "Stay close to me, okay?" Evan nodded, eyes wide but steady. "I'm okay, Dad. I know you are." He stood again and scanned the water once more. The darker seam had widened, almost imperceptibly, a current feeding outward beneath the calm surface. It would look inviting to someone who didn't know better. Smooth water, no breaking waves, easy entry. His jaw tightened. Wind shifted. The scent of sunscreen and citrus cocktails drifted past, mingling with brine and something metallic beneath it. A gull cried overhead, circling lower than before. Back near the roped boundary, the executive's daughter, 16, restless, had slipped away from the cluster of adults. She kicked off her sandals and laughed at something a friend said. Already moving toward the water, Marcus saw her trajectory before anyone else did. He took a single step forward, instinct tugging at muscle memory older than this job, older than the faded logo on his chest. Years ago, a different shoreline had sounded like this. Calm before a call crackled through a radio. He stopped himself. Not his responsibility, he reminded his pulse. He was maintenance now. He checked drainage system. He cleaned salt corrosion from metal rails. He kept his head down. The girl waded deeper. Evan shifted beside him. "Dad." "I see it," Marcus murmured. The darker seam pulsed once, subtle but alive. Water around her calves began to draw outward in a smooth, deceptive slide. Back at the cabanas, the executive raised a glass for a toast. Applause rippled across the private stretch, drowning out the soft change in the ocean's tone. Marcus's fingers tightened around the inhaler. The girl took another step. And the sea, patient until now, pulled. It didn't roar. It didn't announce itself with drama. It simply tightened its grip around the girl's legs and dragged her sideways, then outward, as if the shoreline had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. At first she laughed. Then she stumbled. By the time her smile cracked into confusion, the water was already at her waist, sliding fast beneath her feet. She tried to step back and found nothing solid to step on. "Dad," she shouted, the word thin against the wind. Near the cabanas, the executive lowered his glass too slowly. His smile lingered half a second longer than it should have before dissolving. Conversation stuttered. Someone squinted toward the water. Security shifted but hesitated, waiting for instruction. Marcus was already moving. He didn't run in panic. He moved with intention, boots discarded mid-stride, shirt yanked over his head without breaking rhythm. Sand kicked up behind him as he passed the invisible line no one else had dared to cross. "Call emergency response." Someone yelled. The hired lifeguard grabbed a float and charged forward, but he angled straight toward her, fighting the current instead of reading it. Marcus saw the mistake instantly. "Don't go head on," he barked, voice cutting through noise with practiced command. "Angle left. Let it carry you. Then cross." The lifeguard faltered, confused by the authority in the maintenance worker's tone. The executive stepped forward at last, shoes sinking into wet sand. "Do something." He shouted at security, at the sky, at anyone who would absorb his fear. Marcus hit the water. Cold surged around his ribs, sharp and clarifying. The current tugged immediately, strong and clean, like a conveyor belt built by nature. He didn't fight it. He let it take him 2 beats farther out, conserving strength, then cut diagonally across its shoulder. Behind him, Evan stood frozen near the driftwood line, clutching the inhaler with both hands. Helena Price, the COO, placed herself beside the boy without being asked. "Your dad's trained," she murmured, half to him, half to herself. "He moves like someone who's done this before." Out past the break, the girl's head bobbed once, then vanished. The executive's composure shattered. "Lila," he screamed, voice breaking raw. Marcus reached the outer seam just as she surfaced again, coughing and flailing. Panic made her heavy. Fear turned limbs into anchors. He grabbed her from behind before she could drag them both under. "Listen to me," he snapped near her ear. "I've got you." "Stop fighting it," she thrashed once more. "I've got you," he repeated, tightening his hold with precise economy. On shore, phones were no longer pretending. They were filming openly now. Investors who'd laughed minutes ago stood silent, watching the maintenance diver command the ocean like it answered to him. The lifeguard, redirected, reached them from the correct angle this time, eyes wide with dawning respect. Together they shifted her onto the float. "Kick steady," Marcus instructed. "Don't waste it." They worked with the current instead of against it, sliding sideways before pushing back toward shore on a gentler line. It was technical, exact. No wasted motion, no heroics. Back on sand, the executive paced like a man locked out of his own life. Helena glanced at Evan. "You're breathing okay?" The boy nodded, though his knuckles were white. Water finally shallowed beneath Marcus's boots. He stood, lifting Lila clear as waves broke around his thighs. The crowd rushed forward, then stalled, unsure if they were allowed to step into this moment. He laid her down beyond the reach of foam. She coughed hard, expelling seawater, chest heaving. "Clear space," he ordered calmly. "Give her air." And they did. The executive dropped to his knees beside his daughter, hands shaking uselessly over her shoulders. Lila. Lila. Marcus checked her pulse, her breathing pattern, the color returning slowly to her lips. Controlled, focused, present. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. For a second, quiet spread across both sides of the beach, the luxury and the labor, the rope line erased by necessity. The executive looked up at him, stunned, stripped of posture. You. Marcus met his gaze evenly, water streaming from his hair down his neck. She'll be okay, he said. Then, as paramedics rushed in, and cameras kept recording, he stepped back toward the rougher stretch of sand where his son waited. Before we go further, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens after the rescue matters even more than the rescue itself. Because this wasn't just about a girl pulled from a current. It was about a line in the sand that had just been washed away. Foam slid up to the spot where the rope boundary had been staked earlier, erasing footprints, smoothing over the exact place where power had drawn its border. Paramedics knelt around Lila, oxygen mask secured, voices clipped and efficient. Her breathing steadied beneath the hiss of compressed air. The executive hovered soaked cuffs darkening his expensive sleeves where he'd knelt in the surf. His hands still trembled. Not from cold, from something far more destabilizing. Marcus didn't linger near him. He walked back toward the driftwood line, water dripping from his shorts, chest rising slow and controlled, as if he'd just finished a routine task. Each step felt heavy now that adrenaline ebbed, but he kept his spine straight. Evan ran the last few feet and wrapped both arms around his waist. "You went really far," the boy whispered, voice small but steady. "I know." He crouched, brushing wet hair from his son's forehead. "You did good staying put." The COO approached carefully, heels abandoned somewhere behind her. Sand clung to her slacks. She didn't seem to notice. That was, Helena exhaled, searching for language that didn't cheapen what she'd witnessed. That wasn't maintenance training. He gave a faint shrug. Just knew the pattern. She studied him. The calm, the lack of bragging, the way he directed trained professionals without hesitation. A memory flickered, years ago. A coastal disaster relief headline she'd read while traveling overseas. "You've done that before," she said quietly. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he glanced toward the paramedics loading Lila onto a stretcher. "She'll be monitored for secondary drowning risk. Watch her breathing overnight." Helena blinked. That level of detail wasn't guesswork. Near the waterline, the executive rose slowly as the stretcher passed. Cameras still hovered, capturing his shaken expression, the salt crusted on his designer loafers, the way he reached for his daughter's hand like a man who'd nearly lost everything. Their eyes met again, employer and employee, but the hierarchy felt thinner now, almost translucent. "You're staying," the executive called, voice hoarse. Not a request. Not quite an order either. Something in between. Marcus stood, lifting Evan into his arms. "I'm off duty," he replied evenly. Security shifted uneasily, unsure how to interpret that tone. Helena stepped in before tension could reignite. "We'll debrief later," she said to the executive. Low, but firm. "Right now, your daughter needs you." He hesitated, pride wrestling with reality. Then he nodded and followed the paramedics toward the waiting ambulance. The beach, moments ago buzzing with curated laughter and investment talk, had fallen into reflective quiet. Guests gathered in small clusters, voices subdued. More than one executive replayed the earlier confrontation in their mind. The gesture toward the rope, the public dismissal, the maintenance diver who had simply acted. A junior analyst approached Marcus cautiously. "Sir, were you Coast Guard?" He paused. Evan shifted in his arms, listening. Something like that, he answered. The analyst swallowed. You moved like my uncle did. He was rescue command. Marcus gave a noncommittal nod and turned toward the service access path leading off the beach. The wooden stairs creaked under wet feet. Salt wind cooled against his skin now that motion had stopped. Evan rested his chin on his father's shoulder, breathing steady but thoughtful. "Dad," the boy murmured. "Why was he yelling at you before?" The question landed heavier than the ocean had. "Sometimes people think they own places they don't," he said after a beat. "Sometimes they forget other people matter." Evan considered that. "You didn't forget." A faint smile touched his mouth. "No." Behind them, sirens faded into distance. The rope that had marked exclusivity lay tangled in the tide, one stake pulled loose by shifting water. Helena watched from the base of the stairs, arms folded. Expression changed. She had built her career on reading risk and leadership under pressure. Today had revealed both, just not from the person she'd expected. Her phone vibrated. A notification flashed, multiple social media uploads from guests already circulating. Video of the confrontation. Video of the rescue. The timeline would not be clean. She looked toward the executive parking area where luxury cars gleamed untouched, then back at the maintenance diver carrying his son up weathered wooden steps. Power, she realized, had just shifted in a way spreadsheets couldn't measure. At the top of the stairs, Marcus paused, glancing once more at the horizon. The darker seam in the water had already softened, invisible again to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But he knew. And so did the people who had just watched him command it. By the time he reached the service corridor that connected the public beach to the resort's maintenance wing, his shirt was back on, clinging damp against his shoulders. Evan walked beside him now, hand in his inhaler tucked safely in his pocket. The boy kept glancing up at him like he was trying to memorize something. Behind them, hurried footsteps echoed against concrete. Marcus. He stopped at the sound of his name. Not maintenance. Not "Hey, you." His name. The executive stood a few yards away in the narrow passage between polished luxury and exposed utility pipes. Without the ocean at his back and the crowd around him, he looked different. Smaller, somehow. Salt had dried in uneven streaks across his collar. "We need to talk," he said. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He crouched instead, adjusting Evan's sleeve where sand had rubbed the fabric raw. "Head up to the locker room and wait for me," he told his son quietly. "Helena's right behind you." Evan hesitated. "You're not in trouble, right?" A faint exhale left his chest. "Go on." Helena appeared at the corridor entrance, offering Evan a reassuring nod. The boy moved reluctantly, glancing back twice before disappearing around the corner. Silence pressed in once they were alone. The executive straightened, reclaiming posture like armor. "You should have identified yourself." Marcus blinked once. Identified myself as what? As someone qualified. The statement hung there, thin and brittle. "I'm maintenance," he replied evenly. "That's what I am here." "That's not what you are," the executive shot back, frustration bleeding through. "You gave orders like someone who knew what the current was doing," Marcus finished calmly. Footsteps approached again, 2 security supervisors and a public relations manager hovering at a respectful distance. The corridor suddenly felt too narrow, the hum of electrical panels too loud. "This is already circulating online," Helena said quietly, holding up her phone. "The entire sequence, including earlier." The executive's jaw tightened. Marcus said nothing. "You embarrassed me in front of investors," the executive muttered, lowering his voice. The words landed strangely, almost absurd against what had just happened. He held the man's gaze. "You embarrassed yourself." Security shifted uneasily. Helena didn't intervene this time. For a brief second, anger flared in the executive's eyes, reflexive, defensive. Then, it faltered. The image of his daughter coughing seawater onto the sand had not left him. "You defied a direct instruction," he said, grasping at structure. "You crossed a restricted boundary." "The ocean crossed it first," Marcus replied. The corridor went quiet. Outside, distant helicopter blades from the medical transport thudded faintly against the air. The sound vibrated through the concrete floor, a reminder of what almost hadn't been stopped. The executive ran a hand through his hair, composure slipping again. If something had gone wrong, it didn't. "That's not the point, it is," Marcus said softly. "Because if I'd followed your boundary, she'd still be out there." Helena inhaled slowly. The executive's shoulders sagged a fraction. For the first time, he looked not like a CEO, but like a father recalculating reality. "You put me in an impossible position," he said, but the accusation lacked force now. Marcus shook his head once. No, the current did. Silence thickened again. Somewhere down the corridor, a cleaning cart rattled past, wheels squeaking. The ordinary rhythm of labor resumed as if nothing historic had occurred. Helena stepped closer, voice measured. "There will need to be a formal review," she said, "of the incident. And of earlier conduct." The executive's eyes flicked to her sharply. "Transparency matters," she added. Marcus felt the shift immediately. The narrative was no longer private. It belonged to witnesses, to recordings, to employees who had seen where true authority had come from when it mattered. He bent to retrieve his boots, still damp with sand. "If you're done," he said calmly, "I need to check the shoreline warning flags. That rip won't be the last today." The executive stared at him. "You're going back out there?" he asked. "That's my job." The simplicity of it unsettled him more than defiance would have. As Marcus moved past, their shoulders nearly brushed in the tight corridor, linen grazing faded cotton. Prestige against practicality. "Wait," the executive said again, softer this time. He paused, but didn't turn fully. "Thank you," the man forced out, the words rough and unfamiliar. Marcus inclined his head slightly, neither accepting nor rejecting it. Then he walked toward the service exit that led back to the open sky, leaving the executive standing in fluorescent light, alone with the echo of a boundary he could no longer pretend existed. The metal door groaned as it swung open, and salt wind rushed back in, sharp and alive. The beach had changed in subtle ways. The rope that once marked exclusivity lay slack against the tide. Guests stood in smaller clusters now, voices low, eyes tracking him as he stepped onto the sand. He didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he moved straight to the warning flag post near the service shed. The red marker flapped hard, snapping in the wind like a warning no one had wanted to hear earlier. He adjusted its angle, scanning the horizon again. The darker seam had shifted slightly north. Behind him, whispers followed. "That's him. Maintenance, right?" No, that wasn't just maintenance. Helena emerged from the corridor moments later, heels traded for borrowed flats, phone still in her hand. "The board's already asking questions," she said quietly. "They've seen the footage." He kept his eyes on the water. "That was fast. Investors don't like unpredictability," she replied, "especially when it exposes character." A faint, humorless breath left him. Character's been there a while. She studied him again, more directly now. "You commanded that rescue like you'd run dozens." He tightened the rope securing the flag and finally glanced at her. "Hundreds." The word hung heavy between them. "Coast Guard?" she asked. He hesitated, not from shame but from calculation. Then he nodded once. "Rescue Command." Helena's expression shifted, not surprise, but confirmation. "Why leave?" He looked past her toward where Evan now sat on a weathered bench outside the maintenance shed, legs swinging gently, inhaler resting beside him. The boy watched his father the way some children watch superheroes. "Because some battles aren't at sea," he answered. Wind lifted sand against their ankles. Sirens had faded entirely now, replaced by the steady rhythm of waves. The spectacle was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Further down the shoreline, the executive stood alone near the cabanas, phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried faintly on the wind, controlled but strained. Damage control. Messaging. Optics. He lowered the phone slowly when he noticed Helena and the maintenance diver speaking. For a second, hesitation crossed his face. Then, he started walking toward them. Marcus saw him coming. Evan noticed too, and instinctively reached for the inhaler. The executive stopped a few feet away, careful this time not to gesture toward boundaries. "The board wants a statement," he said, voice steadier now but stripped of arrogance. "They want clarity." "On what?" Helena asked. "On why one of our maintenance employees was the only person capable of responding." Silence stretched. He looked directly at Marcus. "Is there anything else about your background the company should know?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was unsettled. He met his gaze without flinching. "You never asked." A muscle worked in the executive's jaw. "I need to understand," he continued, softer. "Who I've had working under me." "Working under you?" Helena repeated, eyebrow lifting slightly. The wind picked up, lifting grains of sand between them like static. He shifted his stance. "You know what I mean. Do I?" She countered gently. Marcus stepped in before the tension reignited. "I'm here because this job lets me pick my son up from school," he said calmly. "Because it covers his medication. Because it's steady, and before that?" The executive pressed. He glanced once at Evan, then back. "Before that, I commanded a rescue unit responsible for this entire coastline. Hurricanes, night extractions, vessel fires. I trained men who outranked me in age and rank." The admission settled like weight in the air. Helena exhaled slowly. "You were that Hale?" A flicker crossed his face. "I was." The executive stared at him, recognition dawning too late. He'd seen that name before, commendations in old reports, headlines during a storm season years back. "You left all of that," he said quietly. "My wife died," Marcus answered simply. "My son needed me more than the ocean did." Wind moved through the silence. Out beyond the breakers, another subtle shift formed, a smaller rip beginning to thread itself into the tide. He saw it immediately. "Helena," he said without looking away from the water, "clear the swimmers north of the second buoy." She didn't question it. She turned and signaled to security. The executive followed his gaze, finally seeing what he'd missed before. Power didn't look like a title on sand. It looked like a man who could read the sea before it decided to take something else. And for the first time since stepping onto that beach, the executive didn't speak. Before this story continues, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next isn't about gratitude. It's about accountability. The executive didn't move right away. He stood beside the maintenance diver, staring at the water like it had personally betrayed him. The shoreline looked harmless again, families returning cautiously, security repositioning, the rope finally being gathered instead of displayed. But Marcus's eyes remained fixed north of the second buoy. "There," he said quietly. At first, no one else saw it. Then a teenage boy drifted just a little too far beyond the shallow break, laughing with friends, unaware of the subtle sideways pull tightening around him. Helena was already signaling. Security began ushering swimmers back toward safer sand. The executive swallowed. Is it another one? Forming, Marcus answered. Not as strong, but strong enough. He didn't wait for permission. Boots hit sand again as he moved down shore, this time not an emergency sprint, but controlled urgency. The boy felt the tug seconds later and tried to correct straight back toward land. The same mistake as before. Angle, Marcus called out, voice carrying clean and sharp. Don't fight it. The boy panicked anyway. Marcus waded in only waist deep this time, intercepting before the current strengthened. He guided the teenager sideways, teaching mid-rescue rather than simply extracting. When they reached shallower water, the boy stumbled onto sand, embarrassed but safe. You gotta read it, Marcus said calmly. Smooth water isn't always safe water. The boy nodded breathlessly. Pride wounded, but body intact. A small crowd had gathered again, but this time there was no confusion about who was in control. The executive watched everything. He noticed how security deferred to the maintenance diver without thinking. How Helena didn't override him. How even guests quieted when he spoke. Authority had shifted without ceremony. When Marcus stepped back onto dry sand, brushing water from his forearms, the executive approached slower than before. You predicted it, he said. It was predictable. To you, a gull swooped low overhead, crying sharply before veering away. Helena joined them again. We've cleared the northern stretch, she reported. Local lifeguards are adjusting flags. Marcus nodded once. Good. The executive studied him, something unsettled working behind his eyes. Why didn't you tell anyone who you were? Would it have mattered? Marcus replied. The question landed harder than accusation. He thought back, board meetings, performance reviews, the time he'd been cut off mid-suggestion because maintenance concerns weren't strategic priorities. He had never asked about the man's past. Never wondered what skill set stood behind the quiet efficiency. I made assumptions, he admitted finally. Yes, Marcus said. Wind tugged at the executive's sleeves again. Less dramatic now, but persistent. Helena's phone vibrated. She glanced down. The board's requesting an immediate on-site review. They want you both present. The executive exhaled slowly. Now? They've seen the confrontation clip. Silence followed that. Marcus felt Evan's small hand slip into his own again. The boy had walked down shore during the second rescue, eyes wide, but calm. Dad, are we leaving? He asked. Not yet, he answered gently. The executive looked at the boy properly this time, not as a background detail, but as a reason. That's your son, he said quietly. Marcus nodded. How old? 8. He hesitated, then added, Ozma. The executive's gaze dropped briefly to the inhaler clipped to Evan's pocket. Something shifted again, guilt blending with recognition. My daughter's 16, he said after a moment. He didn't finish. Marcus didn't soften, but he didn't harden either. You didn't. The ocean rolled in behind them, steady and indifferent to titles or gratitude. Helena cleared her throat. We need to move. They're setting up in the executive lounge. The executive nodded, then looked at Marcus. I want you there. He considered that. The same lounge he'd never been invited into. The same space overlooking the shoreline where he'd been told he didn't belong. Why? He asked. Because they're going to ask how this happened, the executive said. And I can't answer that without you. A beat passed. This wasn't about thanks anymore. It was about exposure. Marcus glanced once more at the water, stable now. Flags adjusted. Swimmers cautious. Then he looked at his son. You'll sit with Helena for a bit, he said softly. Evan nodded. You're not in trouble. A faint smile touched his mouth. No. As they began walking toward the polished glass doors leading to the executive wing, sand gave way to marble. Wet footprints marked their path behind them, one set large, one small, and for the first time that day, the executive walked half a step behind the man he'd told didn't belong. Marble replaced sand beneath their feet, cool and polished, reflecting distorted silhouettes of linen and damp cotton. The executive lounge overlooked the same shoreline that had nearly rewritten his life. Through the glass, the ocean looked serene again, deceptively obedient. Inside, members of the board were already assembled. Two appeared on a large wall screen from remote locations, faces sharp and expectant. A long table of dark walnut cut through the room like a line drawn with intention. Marcus paused just inside the doorway. He could feel the shift in air pressure, the hum of climate control, the faint scent of espresso and leather chairs. It wasn't unfamiliar territory to him. It was simply territory he no longer claimed. "Have a seat," one board member said, eyes narrowing slightly at his attire. He remained standing. The executive took his place at the head of the table, but didn't sit immediately. His fingers rested on the back of the chair instead, as if he needed support that wasn't visible. Helena closed the door behind them. "We've reviewed the footage," a woman on the screen began without preamble. "Both the rescue and the preceding interaction." The word "preceding" hung heavily. Silence settled like a held breath. The executive inhaled slowly. There was a misunderstanding regarding beach access during a private corporate event. Marcus didn't react outwardly, but something inside him registered the phrasing. Misunderstanding. Clean. Sanitized. On the screen, the woman tilted her head slightly. "The recording shows you instructing him to move." "I did." "And threatening his employment?" The executive's jaw tightened. That was said in frustration. Helena's gaze flicked briefly toward Marcus. He stood still, hands clasped loosely behind his back, posture steady. And then, another board member interjected. The same employee led a successful maritime rescue when contracted safety personnel hesitated. The room felt smaller. Why, the woman asked carefully. Was he the only one capable? The executive looked toward him finally, not with accusation but with something closer to acknowledgement. "Because I didn't ask who he was," he said. The answer startled even Helena. Marcus shifted slightly, weight moving from one foot to the other. He wasn't here for vindication theatrics. He was here because the narrative needed truth. "I served 15 years in Coastal Rescue Command," he said evenly, voice carrying without strain. "Left after my wife passed. Needed stable hours." The board members exchanged glances. That information wasn't disclosed during hiring, one noted. "It wasn't relevant to the position offered," he replied. And yet, Helena added quietly, "It became very relevant today." Outside the glass wall, waves rolled in rhythmic sets. The rope boundary had been fully removed now. Staff worked quietly to dismantle the exclusive setup. The executive finally sat down. "I misjudged him," he said, each word deliberate. Publicly. The admission didn't carry drama. It carried weight. On the screen, the woman leaned forward. The company cannot afford leadership that fails to recognize talent in its own ranks. Silence stretched again, but this time it felt directional. Marcus felt the old instinct rise, the one that once commanded rooms larger than this, with stakes measured in lives instead of reputations. He let it surface just enough. "This isn't about my resume," he said calmly. "It's about assumptions." Helena nodded almost imperceptibly. "When authority confuses visibility with value," he continued, "you miss what's right in front of you." No one interrupted. The executive's gaze dropped briefly to the table. The words weren't accusatory. They were factual. That made them harder to deflect. One board member cleared his throat. There will be a formal review of the incident and conduct. Transparency is non-negotiable. Understood, the executive replied, and the woman added, eyes sharpening, we expect corrective action. Not just a statement. The implication was clear. Culture. Accountability. Public acknowledgement. Marcus felt something shift, not triumph, but equilibrium. He hadn't sought this room, but now that he was here, he wouldn't shrink inside it. Helena's phone buzzed again. She glanced down and then up at the executive. Local news has picked up the footage. He closed his eyes briefly. The ocean outside continued its steady rhythm, unconcerned with board votes or brand management. Marcus thought of Evan sitting just outside the lounge with a paper cup of juice, feet swinging above the marble floor. He thought of hospital invoices folded into a drawer at home. He thought of the invisible lines people drew when they believed titles outranked character. When he looked back at the table, his expression was unchanged. But the room no longer felt like foreign ground. It felt like a place where truth had already entered, and wasn't leaving quietly. The board meeting adjourned without applause, without the false ease that usually followed strategic decisions. Screens went dark, one by one. Chairs shifted back across polished marble. The executive remained seated longer than anyone else, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed not on Marcus, but on the ocean beyond the glass. Helena approached first. They'll want a public statement before the market opens tomorrow, she said. Not just about the rescue. About the confrontation. He nodded, slowly. Draft it. I won't, she replied gently. You will. Silence answered her. Across the room, Marcus stood near the doorway, posture relaxed but alert. He had no stake in stock prices or investor confidence. His stake waited outside with an inhaler and a paper cup of juice. You're free to go, the executive said finally, voice steadier now. Marcus didn't move. That's not why I'm still here, he answered. The words settled heavier than the accusation ever could. Helena watched the exchange carefully. This wasn't about employment status anymore. It was about something more structural, an imbalance that had been exposed in front of cameras and employees alike. The footage is everywhere, she said quietly. Staff group chats, social media, even local veteran forums. The executive's eyes flicked toward Marcus again. Veteran forums? Helena nodded. They recognized your rescue technique, he exhaled slowly. Of course they did. Marcus shifted his weight. You asked who you've had working under you, he said evenly. Now you know. A beat passed. I also know, the executive replied, voice lower, that I stood 30 yards away while you ran toward what I couldn't. It wasn't self-pity. It was recognition. Outside the glass wall, evening light began to soften. The tide had smoothed the sand where the rope once cut a clean division between public and private. Helena's phone buzzed again. She glanced down and then looked up. The union rep just requested a meeting. For what? The executive asked. For treatment concerns, she said. Not just his. The room quieted again. Marcus hadn't filed complaints. He hadn't needed to. The narrative had done the work for him. The executive stood slowly and walked toward the window. From this angle, he could see the maintenance shed near the far stretch of beach. Evan sat on the bench outside, legs swinging, watching the waves like they held secrets only his father could read. He was holding an inhaler, the executive said quietly. Marcus nodded once. Asthma, is he stable? Yes. Another silence. When he turned back around, something in his posture had shifted, not defeated, not diminished, but altered. I will address what happened publicly, he said, not as damage control, as correction. Helena studied him carefully. Be specific, she advised. Vague accountability reads like avoidance. He gave a tight nod. Marcus moved toward the door. "That's between you and your board." "No," the executive said quickly. "It's not." He stepped forward, closing some of the distance between them. "It's between me and you," he continued, "and between me and every employee who watched that footage." The air in the lounge felt different now. Not tense, but transitional. Before this moves forward, subscribe with the bell on, because the next moment isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility finally catching up with power. Marcus paused at the doorway. "You humiliated me in front of my son," he said calmly. Not bitter, not loud, just true. The executive absorbed that without defense. "I did. And if the current hadn't shifted," Marcus continued, "I'd still be the maintenance guy who didn't belong." Helena didn't look away. He took another step toward the door. "Fix that," he said simply. Then he walked out. Marble echoed beneath his boots as he crossed back into the corridor. The sterile air gave way to salt again as he pushed through the service exit. Evan looked up instantly when he saw him. "Are we going home?" "Soon," he replied. The boy studied his face. "You look different." Marcus knelt slightly so they were eye level. Sometimes people have to see something they almost lost before they understand what they had. Evan nodded slowly, not fully grasping the corporate layers, but understanding enough. Behind them, through the glass of the executive lounge, the CEO remained standing alone. He was no longer looking at the ocean. He was looking at the empty space where a rope had once divided worth from labor. And for the first time in a long time, he understood that fixing that line would require more than a statement. It would require change. The executive lounge doors opened again just as Marcus reached the edge of the sand. "Wait." He didn't turn immediately. Evan's hand was still in his, small fingers threaded through his own like an anchor. The tide rolled in steady behind them, calmer now, the danger invisible again to anyone who didn't know where to look. "I'm not done," the executive said as he approached. Helena followed a few steps behind, observant but silent. Marcus faced him fully this time. About what? About what happens next. Wind tugged at the edge of the executive's linen sleeve. The fabric was wrinkled now, salt-stained, no longer immaculate. He seemed aware of it, but not concerned. "The board wants a formal review," he continued. "They also want to know whether we've overlooked talent elsewhere." "That's their job," Marcus replied. "And mine," the executive said. A group of staff members lingered near the maintenance shed, pretending to reorganize equipment while openly watching. Word had spread fast. It always did when hierarchy cracked. Helena stepped closer. "There's pressure," she said carefully. "Internal and external. Veteran groups are asking why someone with your background is scrubbing corrosion off railings." Marcus gave a faint shrug. "Because it pays on time. That's not the point," the executive said. "It is to me." Silence stretched between them, not hostile, measured. The executive exhaled. "I want to offer you a different position." The words landed softly but carried weight. Evan looked up at his father, eyes flicking between both men. Marcus's expression didn't change. Based on what? Based on demonstrated leadership under crisis, the executive answered. "Based on skill. Based on the fact that you commanded that beach more effectively than my entire event team." "And what would that position be?" he asked evenly. "Director of Coastal Safety Operations," Helena interjected. "Overseeing all resort properties along this coastline." It was a serious role. Strategic. Visible. Marcus let the proposal sit in the wind. "You're trying to correct optics," he said. The executive didn't deny it. "I'm trying to correct a mistake. That's not the same thing." Helena watched the exchange closely. The staff near the shed had stopped pretending to work. "You humiliated me publicly," Marcus continued, voice steady. "If you promote me quietly, nothing changes." The executive absorbed that without defensiveness. "What do you want?" he asked. The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't dominant. It was direct. Marcus glanced toward Evan again. The boy stood quietly, inhaler still clipped to his pocket, eyes wide, but thoughtful. "I want acknowledgement," he said. "Not of my Ursum. Of your behavior." Wind shifted. A loose strand of rope rolled across the sand like something discarded. Helena nodded almost imperceptibly. The executive's jaw tightened, not in anger but in recognition of cost. "A public statement," he said slowly. "Yes. Admitting fault, yes, and committing to structural review, yes." He ran a hand over his face, weighing pride against consequence. "Investors. Reputation. Control. Done," he said finally. The word felt different than earlier promises, less reactive, more deliberate. "And the position?" Helena asked. Marcus looked back at the water before answering. He remembered nights on storm-swept decks, radios crackling in darkness. He remembered choosing to walk away from that life when Evan was born. Stability had mattered more than status. "I'll consider it," he said. The executive nodded. "You'll have full autonomy over safety protocols. That includes overriding executive events," Marcus added. A faint breath left him. Yes. Staff along the shed exchanged glances. The power dynamic had shifted again, but this time not through crisis, through negotiation. Evan tugged gently at his father's hand. "Does that mean you'd be in charge of the beach?" Marcus looked down at him. "It means I'd help keep people safe." The boy considered that and smiled slightly. Helena's phone buzzed once more. She glanced down and then up. Local news wants an on-camera statement before sunset. The executive straightened instinctively, then paused. He looked at Marcus instead of stepping ahead. "You'll stand with me," he said. It wasn't a command. Marcus studied him for a long second. "Yes," he answered. Not for him. For the staff watching. For the line that had been drawn. For the correction that needed witnesses. The ocean rolled in again, steady and neutral. This time, when they walked back toward the glass doors together, there was no rope between sand and marble, and no one questioned who belonged. The cameras were already set when they entered the resort's upper terrace. Local news crews adjusted tripods against the wind, microphones fitted with foam shields to muffle the ocean's steady roar. Staff members gathered in careful clusters along the perimeter, pretending to be busy while positioning themselves close enough to hear every word. Marcus stood slightly to the left of the executive, not behind him. Evan remained near Helena, perched on a low stone wall with his inhaler in hand, legs swinging but eyes fixed on his father. The ocean stretched behind them, gold light settling over its surface as the sun began its descent. It looked peaceful now, almost innocent. The reporter signaled they were live in 3, 2. The executive stepped forward. "This afternoon," he began, voice steady but stripped of polish, "I made an assumption about one of our employees that I should not have made." Wind pressed lightly against his jacket. He didn't adjust it. "I publicly instructed him to move from a section of beach I believed should remain exclusive to our private event." A murmur rippled faintly through the gathered staff. That instruction was wrong. No corporate jargon. No deflection. "I allowed status to influence judgment," he continued. "Minutes later, when a rip current pulled my daughter into open water, the same employee I had dismissed became the only person capable of leading her rescue." Cameras zoomed subtly closer. He did so without hesitation, without regard for prior insult. He acted because someone needed help. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes. But he didn't shift. The executive turned slightly toward him. Not as spectacle, but acknowledgement. I failed to recognize the experience and leadership already within our workforce, he said. That failure reflects on me, not on him. Helena watched the crowd carefully. Heads nodded. Phones recorded from multiple angles. Effective immediately, the executive continued, we are initiating a full review of employee advancement structures and internal culture. We will not allow title to blind us to talent again. The reporter raised a hand. Sir, is it true that the employee in question previously served in Elite Coastal Rescue Command? It is, he answered. And I never asked. The honesty landed heavier than any rehearsed line could have. And what will change? Another reporter pressed. The executive didn't hesitate this time. He has been offered the role of Director of Coastal Safety Operations across all properties, with full authority over shoreline protocols, including executive events. A stir moved through the staff. Marcus finally stepped forward when Helena gave him a small nod. I didn't act for a title, he said calmly when the microphone angled toward him. I acted because someone was in danger. His voice carried easily over the wind. But today exposed something else, he added. When we measure worth by position instead of capability, we put people at risk. Silence settled across the terrace. I took this job because it let me be present for my son, he continued, glancing briefly toward Evan. Stability mattered more than prestige. The boy's chin lifted slightly. I'll accept the new role, Marcus finished, on one condition. The executive didn't flinch. That respect isn't reserved for emergencies. A beat passed. It won't be, the executive replied. Cameras captured the exchange, no handshake yet, just eye contact that carried the weight of a line erased. Questions continued for several minutes. About training, about safety audits, about accountability. The sun dipped lower. Eventually, the live broadcast concluded. Crews began dismantling equipment. Staff dispersed more slowly. Conversations no longer whispered, but open. Helena approached first once the microphones were lowered. That was the right tone, she said to the executive. He nodded, but his eyes were on Marcus. I meant what I said, he added quietly. I know, Marcus replied. Evan ran over then, unable to contain himself any longer. Dad, you were on TV. A faint smile broke across his face. Guess so, you didn't even sound nervous. He crouched slightly to meet his son's gaze. Calm helps. The executive watched the exchange, something thoughtful settling behind his expression. You chose to stay, he said softly. I chose to lead differently, Marcus corrected. The ocean continued its rhythm behind them, unimpressed by titles, indifferent to applause. But something fundamental had shifted, not just on the sand, in the structure that had once assumed who belonged where. And this time, the correction had witnesses. The terrace had emptied slowly, leaving only the hush of evening wind and the distant murmur of staff resetting cabanas for the next day. Sunset bled amber across the horizon, softening the hard lines of glass and steel behind them. Marcus stood near the railing overlooking the shoreline, hands resting loosely against cool metal. Evan had fallen into quiet conversation with Helena a few yards away, showing her how the inhaler clipped onto his pocket just in case. Footsteps approached without urgency. I owe you more than a statement, the executive said. Marcus didn't turn immediately. The ocean was darker now, currents invisible but still present beneath the surface. You don't owe me gratitude, he replied evenly. You owe your people consistency. The wind carried a long pause between them. I built this company from nothing, the executive said quietly. Every inch of it, I know. And somewhere along the way, he continued, voice thinning slightly. I started believing that meant I saw everything. Marcus turned then. You saw growth, he said. You stopped seeing people. The words weren't cruel. They were steady. The executive leaned against the railing beside him, mirroring the posture unconsciously. When I saw you on that beach, he admitted, I didn't see a father. I saw a disruption. Marcus let that sit. And when you ran into the water, the executive continued, gaze fixed forward, I realized I didn't even know the names of half the men who keep this place standing. Below them, maintenance staff moved methodically along the shoreline, securing equipment, lowering umbrellas, smoothing sand for morning guests, the quiet labor that made luxury possible. You called it a misunderstanding in there, Marcus said. It wasn't, the executive answered. Another silence settled, less tense now, more reflective. My daughter asked me something in the ambulance, he added after a moment. Marcus glanced sideways. She asked why the man I yelled at saved her without hesitation. Wind pressed gently against them again. What did you tell her? Marcus asked. The executive exhaled slowly. That leadership isn't proven by who listens to you. It's proven by who you protect. The words felt earned, not rehearsed. Marcus studied his face, searching for performance. He found none. She also asked why you work here, the executive continued. And what did you say? That I didn't know. Marcus looked back toward Evan, who was now laughing at something Helena had said. Small shoulders relaxed. I work here, he said quietly, because I can pick him up from school every day. Because I can sit in a hospital room without asking permission. Because I'm done measuring worth by rank. The executive nodded slowly. I measured it that way for too long, he admitted. A gull cried overhead, cutting briefly through the stillness. Culture doesn't change with one speech, Marcus said. It changes with daily choices, I know. Then start there. They stood side by side, no longer divided by rope or corridor, watching the tide roll in steady sets. The ocean didn't care who commanded boardrooms. It only responded to those who understood it. I won't forget today, the executive said after a while. Don't, Marcus replied. But don't make me the exception either. That landed deeply. Helena approached quietly with Evan, giving them a respectful distance but close enough to signal the night was winding down. Car's ready, she said gently. The executive straightened but didn't retreat into formality. Tomorrow, he said, we start restructuring safety and advancement review. I'd like you involved from the beginning. I will be, Marcus answered. Not because he needed validation, because others did. Evan slipped his hand back into his father's. Can we get burgers on the way home? The boy asked, breaking the gravity of the moment. Marcus smiled faintly. Yeah, we can. The executive watched them turn toward the exit, silhouettes framed by fading light. For years he had believed power meant standing above the shoreline. Today he learned it sometimes meant standing in the water. And sometimes it meant listening to the man who had. The next morning didn't arrive with applause or headlines blaring across skyscrapers. It came quietly, with the low hum of early tide and the smell of coffee drifting through the resort's service corridor. Marcus walked the shoreline before sunrise. Evan had insisted on coming, hoodie pulled over his head, inhaler clipped in place. The sand was cool under their shoes. The rope that once divided the beach was gone entirely, stakes removed, holes filled. The ocean stretched out calm and silver beneath pale light. Is it safe today? Evan asked, squinting toward the water. It's always changing, Marcus answered. Safe just means you're paying attention. Behind them, a new sign was being installed near the access path. Not a warning of exclusivity. A notice about Rip Current education, safety briefings, and open reporting for all staff, regardless of title. Helena stood nearby overseeing the setup, sleeves rolled up, expression focused. Morning, Director, she called lightly. Marcus glanced back at her, a faint smile touching his mouth. Still getting used to that. Get comfortable, she replied. You've got your first cross-property call in an hour." He nodded once. The executive stepped onto the sand moments later, not in tailored loafers this time, but in simple shoes more suited for uneven ground. He paused a few feet away, watching father and son stand side by side at the water's edge. "I read the overnight reports," he said. Employee feedback was candid. Marcus arched an eyebrow slightly. And necessary. Wind moved gently between them. "I've scheduled open forums at every property." The executive continued. "No rank-based seating. No filtered questions." Helena glanced up at that, approving. "Good," Marcus said. Evan bent to pick up a smooth shell from the wet sand. "Can I keep this?" he asked. "Yeah," Marcus answered. "That one's earned." The executive watched the exchange with quiet thoughtfulness. "My daughter wants to meet you properly," he said after a moment. "Without all of that," Marcus nodded. "When she's ready." Silence settled comfortably now, not strained, not hierarchical. Staff began arriving in waves behind them, greeting Marcus differently than before. Not with awe, with recognition. He responded the same way he always had, with steady nods, clear instructions, calm presence. The ocean rolled in again, brushing the shore without discrimination. Power hadn't vanished, it had shifted shape. The executive extended a hand, not as a gesture for cameras, not as obligation, but as acknowledgement. Marcus took it. No applause followed. Just wind. Just water. Just work beginning again, differently. Evan tugged at his father's sleeve. "Burgers again tonight?" He laughed softly. "We'll see." The executive smiled faintly at that. Lines drawn in sand don't survive the tide. But lessons do, if someone chooses to remember them. Before we close this story, tell me something. What injustice should we tackle next? Ask me for the next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. A lonely millionaire CEO spent Christmas Eve alone until a single mom and her twin daughters walked in. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?